Hello everyone, hello from Mediascope. Today we are together with Professor Jan-Werner Müller from Princeton University, a professor of political science, who is also the author of the book Was ist Populismus, or What is Populism, which was translated into many languages. Mr. Müller, thank you for accepting our invitation.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it's been 3 years that your book was published. So, is there anything that you change your mind about what populism is, or how significant it is in order to explain the current phenomenon that we are trying to explain?
It's a tricky question, because if you say, no, I'm not changing my mind about anything, you're seen as dogmatic. And if you say, no, I want to amend this and that, then people say, oh, he doesn't know what he's talking about, you know, if he's constantly changing his mind. So one aspect that I think has maybe become even clearer is that not only can populists govern, contrary to the widespread view that almost by definition they're bound to fail once they get to power, because it's often assumed that all their policy ideas are so horrendously simplistic that they will fail immediately once they're in government, and then their supporters either abandon them, or populists become more pragmatic, moderate somehow, or actually a variation of this expectation that populists are all anti-elitist, it's often said, so once they get into power, they can't keep, you know, railing against the elite anymore. Contrary to all these expectations, I think we've found even more in the last few years that populists can govern. Moreover, they can govern specifically as populists, which I think means that on one level they do not fundamentally accept the legitimacy of an opposition, and they've developed, you might say, a whole range of techniques of government, a kind of almost a sort of knowledge of how to govern, or an art of governance, if you like, that to some degree can be shared, can be copied, where this international of populists, or as sometimes nowadays people say, strongmen, can basically learn something from each other and to some degree strengthen each other. And this is something that perhaps also is a blow to a particular idea, or some might say illusion, that many observers had after the end of the Cold War, where the assumption was that yes, democracies screw up all the time, they're constantly mistakes, but democracy is the only learning system. So only democracies can admit mistakes, change course, adapt, and so on. And conversely, the assumption was that all authoritarian systems end like the Soviet Union in 1991 because they can't learn, they can't correct course, and so on. And I think one thing we have, alas, learned in the last couple of years is that no, democracy might not have that monopoly on learning.
Mm-hmm. So as far as I see it, it's not a change of mind, but it's what we have been experiencing, and what you mentioned is just a support of your arguments that you develop in your book, right?
I would say that, although maybe if I may, I would add one other aspect. Please. So, as you know, much commentary is dominated by the image of an allegedly unstoppable wave of populism. And this is, of course, also a story that populist leaders tell about themselves. They themselves very often want to convince us that a kind of domino theory is correct. You probably will remember 2016, 2017, people were saying, well, first Brexit, then Trump, and then probably next Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, Marine Le Pen in France, and so on. And I worry that even observers who have, let's say, not necessarily a lot of sympathy for populist leaders have adopted this kind of framing, this kind of narrative, which I think in one respect at least is very misleading. What I mean is the fact that basically up until this day, nowhere in Western Europe or North America have at least far-right populists come to power without the collaboration of very established conservative elites. Nigel Farage didn't bring about Brexit all by himself. He needed heavyweights from the Tory party. Donald Trump wasn't the candidate of a spontaneous grassroots movement of, as the cliche has it, angry white working class males. No, he was the candidate of a very established party in the end. And as banal as it might sound, the best explanation from a broadly speaking political science point of view of what happened on that fateful day, November 8th, 2016, is, well, actually something very normal. People who identify with a party went to the polls and voted for their party, which is what most people in most elections tend to do. So, long story short, had he not been the candidate of the Republican Party, he certainly would not be president. So this is often not seen, the agency, the role, if you like, of much more established actors. And, last thing I'll add, if I may, the, if you like, mainstreaming of some of the content, some of the ideas of the far right. That's something that I think has become much more pronounced in the last few years. So the fact that, to give you just one concrete example, that the Austrian Chancellor decided that it was acceptable to have a coalition with a far-right populist party, and clearly, to a significant degree, has copied simply what they offer by way of content and frames and so on. And yes, he keeps saying that they're red lines, but with all due respect for the innocent observer on the outside, it's often hard to see where exactly these red lines are being drawn. So I think, long story short, we shouldn't always just be sort of fixated on populists as sort of independent actors. We should always see the larger dynamic. And there's something, I think, very worrying going on that we don't see if we focus on populists in isolation.
Well, this reminded me on, interestingly, the case of Germany, where AfD was maybe not in a coalition with, but in terms of ideas or in terms of the approach to refugees, was very close to the CSU, if not CDU. Well, could you do you think it's also an example of what you said, a collaboration between the established conservatives and the populists?
Well, I think you can read what happened in different ways, but what I would put forward as a at least somewhat plausible understanding of what we actually witnessed was that, yes, for a while, the CSU, so the Christian Democrats in Bavaria, who always said, you know, there cannot be a party to the right from us, for a while really, in a sense, tried to basically bet on this, in a sense, you might say, very paradoxical strategy of destruction through imitation. So by becoming like them, you actually get rid of them. And I think what then happened with the elections in the autumn is that one could safely conclude that at least this time around this didn't really work. And I think a lot of the relevant actors seem to have also taken away that conclusion, which I think is relatively good news. But I think in the overall European context, I worry that, if you like, the trend is more in the other direction. That what we used to know as center-right parties basically are more and more willing to either condone the far right, outright collaborate with the far right, or simply copy the far right while pretending not to be doing this. And this, if I may add one thought, I think this might have something to do with what at least some observers, I think, rightly diagnose as a real vacuum of ideas on the center-right. People nowadays incessantly talk about the crisis of social democracy for good reasons. But I think if you ask citizens, you know, what is social democracy, what is socialism about, I think many people could still give you some kind of answer. If nowadays you ask people in Europe, what is the center-right really about? I think people would have a much harder time. And ideals which traditionally used to be associated, let's say, with Christian democracy, European integration, at least moderating, containing, maybe even overcoming the nation state, these sorts of things have largely disappeared. People don't remember them. So I'm not saying that ideas determine everything, but they do matter too. And if you don't have any ideas of your own, it becomes much more plausible or likely that you kind of become very opportunistic in terms of how you move around, and it becomes more likely that you basically move in the direction of the far right.
So let me be back to the conceptual discussion now. So there's been a discussion in intellectual circles or academic circles about how rightful it is to use populism as the leading concept to explain today's world. Many think that using populism causes automatically the underestimation of the autocratic or the authoritarian structure of the regimes in question. And many also refer to the idea of, or the concept of neo-fascism even, to describe the regimes we are talking about. So what do you think on that?
So first of all, and forgive me if we now drift into an obscure methodological debate. So a concept, or you might say certain ideal types, first of all just try to help us identify a particular kind of phenomenon or a constellation of forces and factors. So it's not necessarily an explanation. And I don't really claim that, you know, the book is primarily about explaining what is going on. It's more about, okay, let's see what's distinctive about this particular phenomenon. And if others say, look, you know, you're right about the phenomenon, but I would like to give it another label and call it something different, because let's say in the United States, populism for historical reasons means something a bit different than in many European countries, has more positive connotations along the lines of grassroots activism, I would say fine. As long as we can agree on, you know, that this phenomenon is sort of distinctive and that it actually doesn't immediately collapse into, let's say, other concepts of trying to capture phenomena that we know from history, such as fascism. So clearly it's a mistake to think that we could easily somehow glean lessons from history, as if, you know, everything sort of comes back a second time. Still, I'm somewhat skeptical about the claim that we are really witnessing something that is meaningfully described as fascism. And the reason is that, at least from my point of view, fascism inextricably involves a cult of violence, the suggestion that the best kind of human life is one of mortal combat, mortal confrontation, hence, maybe not an accident, that all genuinely fascist regimes eventually go to war. Fascism also involves a real mass mobilization of society, unlike forms of authoritarianism, where society obviously is kept down in a certain way, but is not necessarily mobilized. And fascism, for me, also involves a systematic, if you like, racialized restructuring of the state. Now, do populists today sometimes encourage violence? Yes. Do they incite hatred against minorities? Yes. Do some of them condone racism from the very top? Yes. But it still, for me, doesn't add up to a kind of comprehensive, ideologically driven project in a way that I think those who say it's like fascism would have to show and prove. So I think making the argument that it's not fascism doesn't mean, oh, and therefore not to worry about, you know, it's not so bad, and so on. Not at all. But I think on one level, we just also have to be prepared for something novel. We have to be prepared for the possibility, and this goes back to something we talked about at the beginning, that it's also bad actors, to put it very bluntly, who learn from history. So, you know, we tend to assume learning from history is always good. Only good guys learn from history, you know, fine. But in a sense, today's, if you like, authoritarian populists, I think are also learning. And I think one of the things they, to some degree, have learned is that precisely they shouldn't produce images which would remind audiences too easily of basically pictures that are in their mind from 20th century fascism, extremely repressive authoritarianism, and so on. So I think one of the imperatives for observers, academics, journalists today might precisely be to figure out how some of these authoritarian populists are managing to exert control over their societies in some contexts without having to go all the way in terms of violence, without having to go all the way in terms of, let's say, the abolition of certain basic liberties. I mean, just one concrete example. let's say in Hungary, you can still blog, you know. There is still a commercial TV channel that is not owned by the government. You know, there are still sort of, you know, spaces where you can voice oppositional content to your heart's content. Nevertheless, unless one understands that basically the local media are more or less owned by people close to the government, unless one understands these more subtle mechanisms, one doesn't see how the control de facto works without, in a sense, openly having to say, and now, you know, we're done with press freedom entirely. So I think we need to do our own thinking about what is specific in our era, how these regimes have, in a sense, innovated maybe in terms of how they exert control. And we can't just rely on sort of something we can take off the shelf and we're going to find in history books.
Mm-hmm. And there has been also a group of other academics or intellectuals where the tendency to emphasize upon the democratic aspects of those regimes has also been existent. And we have seen that those people labeled these regimes illiberal democracies, emphasizing upon the illiberal aspect of these regimes, the anti-liberal aspects of these regimes, but still calling them democracies, maybe because of the existence of elections. So what do you think on that?
So I worry that it's been a real victory for the leaders of some of these regimes, that they've convinced international audiences that yes, they are still democracies, just democracies of the illiberal kind. And I think this is highly problematic on a conceptual level, but it's also highly problematic on a, if I may put it that way, strategic level in terms of how one interacts with these regimes. So on a conceptual level, clearly there are plenty of policy questions where you could be more or less liberal, and that's, you know, not incomprehensible as a particular stance, and it's also not in and of itself, you might say, undemocratic if somebody says, you know, I want less immigration, or I have a very conservative understanding of the family and I'm going to push certain legislation in that direction. Maybe not the kind of thing you and I would like, but that's a debate we can have within a democracy, and I think it would be wrong to say that, oh, anybody who says this is automatically outside the realm of democracy. But what the regimes in question, again, let's take Hungary as the prime example, because Viktor Orban, of course, has been so vocal in saying, you know, we are illiberal Democrats, has de facto been doing, quite apart from these policy questions, is basically to cut down on basic democratic rights. So unless you want to say that, oh, there's an election still, and the government doesn't literally stuff the ballot boxes on the day to manipulate the outcome, unless that is your definition of democracy, I think then the curtailing of media pluralism, free speech, free assembly in all kinds of ways, is not just illiberal or anti-liberal, it's in and of itself undemocratic. And we should be clear about it. We should be clear about that. Which brings me to that second strategic level. Obviously, we should not tailor our theoretical thinking or our concepts around these strategic considerations. But we also shouldn't be naive about the fact that eventually how we talk about certain phenomena finds its way, maybe from academia, from more intellectual circles, into actual political conflict. And there I think it's fateful to basically tell these actors, yes, you can have democracy. We're just concerned about liberalism. Because even though many of our colleagues would now say, well, there has been a kind of democratic recession worldwide, the number of democracies might be declining, maybe not. But it's certainly still true that many countries want to be seen as democratic. There's still a big premium on the outside observers saying, yes, we can certify you as a real democracy. So it's not particularly damaging to you if somebody says you're illiberal, but if somebody says, look, in your country, democracy is being damaged, that's much more of a problem. Specifically also, it's maybe worth emphasizing that in the European context or the EU context, I think it creates a kind of fateful division of labor if now a sort of image emerges where basically the nation state does democracy, and then, you know, the EU shows up and saves liberalism and the rule of law and so on. So it sort of suggests that, you know, here is plucky Viktor Orban building a real national democracy, and then, you know, Franz Timmermans from the European Commission, who is after all charged with, you know, rule of law issues, shows up with his repair, you know, crew and says, oh, we'll fix the rule of law for you and so on. It kind of creates an opposition in people's minds that I think is misguided. And instead, EU actors should say, look, there's plenty of things at the level of policy that people can do differently in the European Union. The EU doesn't tell you what you have to do about, you know, abortion law and all kinds of other issues. But we do care that you are a real democracy. And if we are so worried that in a sense we start to intervene in certain ways, it's because of democracy and not just because of liberalism.
Mm-hmm. And in your book, while you were explaining the reasons why populism has become like a transnational trend in the world right now, you say that one should admit the flaws in the liberal democracy or in the democracy that were established in the Western world. So what are these flaws?
So I think there's been one particular dynamic which I think it's plausible to say has been helpful for populist actors. It's not a sort of, you know, inherent deep flaw in democracy itself, I would say, but it's a constellation where politicians adopt an attitude which, for shorthand, you might call technocratic. Basically, politicians say there's only one rational solution for a particular policy problem. If you disagree, you essentially reveal yourself to be irrational. We don't need to have debates around this. Parliament simply should push it through. That's the only way to go. If that attitude is adopted, it makes it much easier for populists to say, wait a minute, democracy without choices? What do you mean? Where are the people in all this? And in a sense, they have a point when they say that, which doesn't mean that they then become the authentic defenders of democracy. If they then are successful, a kind of vicious circle might start. So if populists come to power, technocrats will say, oh, God, you give the people a choice, and they elect crazy demagogues. So ideally, let's take even more decision-making power away from people. And so technocracy and populism come to reinforce each other. And maybe less obviously, even though they look like opposed extremes, they actually do share one trait, I would say, namely a certain type of anti-pluralism. So the technocrat says only one rational solution to the policy issues. Mm-hmm. If you disagree, irrational. The populist says only one authentic will of the people, and only we, the populist leaders, know what that will is. And if you disagree, you're a traitor. You're not properly American, you're not properly Polish, or whatever it might be. So everything that I think we should think of as democracy, exchange of arguments, real debates, people changing their minds occasionally, and so on, basically disappears between these two poles. And I think we've seen this sort of dynamic, for instance, in the course of the Euro crisis, very strongly. I worry that this has become a temptation for the one example that is now often held up as, oh, this is how you defeat populists. I'm talking about Emmanuel Macron. I think with Macron there has also been sometimes a tendency to default into this rhetoric of saying, here is basically a reasonable or even rational center, which is why he also, of course, could say to other politicians, doesn't matter whether you used to be socialist or on the right, you can all sort of unite in this one reasonable center, and then whatever else is there, so basically Marine Le Pen and Jean-Luc Mélenchon, that's sort of irrational extremes, and we don't have to worry about that or even listen to that, and so on. So I don't think this is a good path to go down on. You should, of course, defend your policies and say, look, this is why I think our approach is correct, but not with arguments along the lines of, oh, anybody who says something else is basically unreasonable, extremist, we don't have to listen to.
What kind of a role does neoliberalism play in the story of this lack of options or lack of other lack of options?
Well, it plays a role to the extent that it was tied up with the emergence of, what people used to call the third way. So the acceptance of a number of, if you like, neoliberal ideas by parties which were nominally on the left, were nominally supposed to present people with a different choice, a different set of options. So yes, it's related. At the same time, I think it's sometimes too quick when people say, "Oh, we can entirely explain populism around the world just with neoliberalism." We always, well, not we always, but there's been a tendency, to put it more mildly, among observers to say, well, the populists, these are the people who have all these simplistic answers, and we do complexity, they do simplicity. But let's be honest, many people, including many very sophisticated observers, would also love it if you could explain everything, with one word or in 140 characters or something along those lines, and just identify the one obvious macro cause of everything. And without being defeatist about the possibilities for social scientists to make sense of what's going on, I'm just wary of these very quick, "Oh, it's all one thing" explanations. You need to, I think, still look more closely at particular national contexts. And maybe less obviously, you also need to look more closely of how populist leaders perform a certain, if you like, cultural work. Because if you're a populist, you need to convince people that there is a homogeneous, corrupt elite. If you can't convince people of that, it's not really populism, okay? So that takes some work. That's not always so obvious. And to do that, and to kind of put in place also a cultural image of the real people, or to provide a certain kind of ideological justification of, why these are the real people and those people over there are not, that takes time and particular kind of /cultural intellectual work. And we need to understand these things in a more subtle way, as opposed to having this sometimes very crude economic reductionism.
Well, during the discussions on populism, many people also have thought of what should be the real response to populism. And considering the fact that while we are talking about populism, we are often talking about right-wing populism or extreme right, there have been many leftist movements which some label as leftist populists and some others label as neo-leftist movements. Do you think leftist populism or such movements are a real or a good response to populism, or are they likely to come up with a new understanding of future where populists will no more be there?
Depends what we're talking about. So within my framework, left-wing populism is not a good idea, because populism is not a good idea. So if we say that, oh, we can only somehow defeat right-wing populism if now there's a left-wing response that is also anti-pluralist, that outright denies the legitimacy of other contenders for power and so on, I would say no, don't go there. And by the way, it's not obvious empirically that this is really such a great strategy to follow. If we mean by left-wing populism, there should be a genuine option, let's say something that looks much more like traditional social democracy, and it's partly generated in a bottom-up way, I would say, of course, that's something that is entirely desirable. It enriches a democracy to have these options. It's probably something that many people want to see happen. Empirically, it seems it's something that can work remarkably well. Just as one example, we all remember how Jeremy Corbyn used to be ridiculed in the media. People say, this guy who time traveled out of a different era, absolutely hopeless contender. And lo and behold, it turns out there are many people who seem to be longing for something that seemed like a decent social democratic option. Same with Bernie Sanders in the US. Now, I just see no reason why one would put someone like Sanders in the same category as Trump, beyond some ultimately banal point about, oh, they both are sort of in some way against the establishment or against their own parties in some way. But I think analytically this gives us no real traction, and I don't think it's really such again, just on a strategic level, it's really such a great idea for people on the left to say, yeah, now on some level we want to be like Trump or like Marine Le Pen and so on. If all you mean is we want to also be somehow more emotional, fine, but that's trivial as a kind of political prescription. If you mean something beyond that, in line with real theorists like Ernesto Laclau from Argentina, then I think it's something, from my point of view, we should be concerned about.
So, if I'm not mistaken, you say that with the future perspectives of political movements like that of Corbyn or Sanders in the US, there may be a possibility of building a new future where popularization of political liberalism can be combined with a new economic understanding where social justice is also important. So, did I understand correctly?
Yeah, so in a sense you don't, but even, I wouldn't even sort of use the word liberalism in this context, but to basically say you can firmly and passionately advance an agenda that in many ways, correctly takes as its starting point that we have economies which in certain ways really are rigged. I mean, not everybody who talks about things being rigged and about corruption is empirically always wrong or is therefore a dangerous populist. So I think you can have a sort of hard-hitting diagnosis of what has happened in a number of Western countries. You can uphold ideals of justice without, in a sense, having to somehow let go of, to put it bluntly, democracy, or without starting to incite hatred against minorities, and without giving up on basically a willingness to recognize the legitimacy of the other side, while hoping that you will comprehensively defeat them on the basis of your arguments and the passionate engagement of your followers and so on. I mean, one thing that is less sort of obvious to say in this context that I think we should maybe keep an eye on. It's too early, I think, to tell and too early to sort of condemn these experiments, but it's something that one should be perhaps a bit concerned about, is that on one level, from my point of view, it's a very good thing that a phenomenon like Podemos, let's say, now exists, in terms of giving people a sense that, yes, Spanish democracy is something different and arguably something better than it was in a situation where you basically had two parties with a certain degree of corruption. People felt they had no real choice and so on. It's a good thing that a party has emerged that also has been very successful, especially with young, highly educated people who are willing to kind of exercise that option, but who are also willing to basically accept defeat, which is not always a given in a democracy. But what is slightly a question mark, to put it mildly, is that of course a lot of these new parties have also very explicitly said, not only do we enrich democracy more broadly, we are also very democratic in the way we set up our own parties and how we kind of, or so they say, have transformed movements into parties. And to put it, cautiously, that's not always so obvious that this is really what is going on. If you look at, these intra-party mechanisms which are touted as more participation, more say for members and so on, I fear it's often not what it's cracked up to be. Very often these seem to be much more like basically online mass plebiscites. They're not really about meaningful participation by a mass base over time. That doesn't entirely take away from the importance of these new parties for democracies in general, but to the extent that people might have expectations along the lines of not only do they have an important agenda, but they also experiment with new ways of doing politics at a grassroots level. There, the jury, to put it again cautiously, is still very much out.
I know that you are personally not a fan of making predictions about the future, but if we just imagine a future where populists will be democratically defeated, and democracy as we know it will be restored in this way or the other. Do you think that it will be the same liberal democracy that we know, or will it be something else?
Very good, i.e. very difficult question. So if some of the experiments that are now going on, for instance, with political parties are successful, let's say, then maybe it'll be a somewhat different kind of democracy. But it's way too early, I think, to tell. There are structural problems, again, to put it very mildly, that I think have to be somehow addressed in one way or the other. And I think unless they are addressed in one way or the other, then yes, you may sort of defeat, a populist party, but it's very likely that legitimate discontent with some of these issues is going to come back. So just as one obvious example, many people feel that, look, democracy holds out a promise of collective decision-making power. I mean, no matter how idealized that image is, that's a core promise that democracy makes. If people feel, but look, the decisions are now always made somewhere else. They're made beyond the nation state. They're made in fora that, are simply very hard for us to understand. There's such an asymmetry between what I can influence as a citizen or what even I can understand as a citizen and how things really work, then that is a pretty big systemic challenge that needs to be tackled in one form or another. One other aspect that perhaps is less obvious, sort of is related to the point about political parties, but I think one thing that is also generally the case with populists, as many of our colleagues have said, is that they try to disempower or maybe sometimes outright destroy intermediate or mediating institutions. So in particular, the two institutions that I think ever since the 19th century have been considered crucial for the functioning of representative democracy, namely political parties and professional media, have very often been attacked or more or less been disempowered by populists, because populists suggest there can be a direct connection between the citizen, the real people, and their one authentic leader. So it's not against the idea of representation. We're still talking about a representative mechanism. The leader represents the people. It's not direct democracy, even though it's often conflated with that. But it's basically representation without anything really in between. And if you find anything worthwhile in my suggestion that populism is about a particular kind of anti-pluralism, then maybe it's also worth going back to the question, so what is exactly the role of these mediating institutions? What do they add to our democracies which otherwise we don't have? And two tentative suggestions in this context are indeed, first of all, pluralism. So even if obviously a party is not infinitely open to all positions, you are committed to a set of principles. That's why you are a partisan. But I think a well-functioning party allows real disagreement about what, let's say, certain underlying political principles mean for us today. So let's say you're a social democrat, that doesn't execute itself somehow in terms of policy and concrete ways forward. So you're going to have a debate, disagreement, and so on and so forth. And yes, there's a reason why Oscar Wilde famously said the problem with socialism is it takes too many evenings. We shouldn't idealize the world of endless party meetings and committees and so on and so forth. Sure. Nevertheless, I think these sorts of mechanisms injected a degree of pluralism into our systems that will disappear if we have what is sometimes now called television parties or digital parties, where basically here's leadership, and yeah, there might even be nominally a mass base, but not much happens by way of real debate. And the same, arguably, goes for well-functioning media, where yes, people of course know that sometimes you have media that tends more towards the right, sometimes more towards the left, and so on. But still, there is a kind of degree of internal debate and pluralism that is important. As opposed to, forgive the cliche, a world where you say, look, it's entirely between the president and me. I only care about what he tweets, or as some of his collaborators at one point suggested, why don't the American people just get their news directly from the president? I think we all kind of understand what's wrong with that suggestion, but I think it might help us in terms of the long-term rebuilding of democracies to specifically revisit this question of intermediary powers and how they might be structured in a world that clearly is not quite the same world of mass parties with branches and cultural involvement and so on. But that, I think, is an important challenge, and it's often not mentioned because people immediately want to jump into a policy discussion and say, oh, if only we solved the cleavage between cities and countryside, or we did better things for the losers of global. I mean, all these are important things. I'm not dismissing it. I'm just saying that we should also bear in mind this other dimension of politics beyond just policy.
Sorry to interrupt, but don't you think that judiciary is also important in that aspect? Because considering what has been happening in Turkey, for example, it's been proven that an independent or a decent judiciary is not only a necessary entity for the inspection, but also for a functioning representative democracy, because we have just a Supreme Electoral Board composed of high judges that cancelled an election where actually representative democracy has been very much damaged. So don't you think that as a third actor, judiciary plays an important role in a well-functioning representative democracies?
In a well-functioning democracy, some of the elements we've been talking about ideally reinforce each other. So a judiciary will, for instance, also turn out to be crucial for free media and protect basic rights to information, basic rights to free speech in such a way that the various sort of elements that need to be in place for a democracy, in a sense, help each other. Again, it's noticeable how some of these very savvy populist leaders have hijacked entirely legitimate discussions, for instance, about too much judicial power in other contexts, and sort of misled international observers by saying, look, you know, there are plenty of critics in the United States, for instance, who say the Supreme Court has too much power. How come that 9 people are deciding policy issues which are not about basic democratic rights in many cases, but which should be decided by legislatures? So one can have a very meaningful debate about this, and, for instance, can have the view that, well, an independent judiciary should restrict itself to basically reinforcing a kind of constitutional court should basically reinforce basic democratic rights, but should be very cautious in involving itself in too many kind of detailed policy questions. That, I think, as mentioned earlier about our discussion relating to immigration and so on, that's, I think, a debate one can have. And that's also, of course, one reason why democracies look so different. You know, we don't have like a one sort of model and everybody has to converge on that. No, there's legitimate disagreement about how we want to structure our democracies. But that is obviously very different from the kind of systematic disempowerment of independent judiciaries that basically populists, when they themselves had enough power, have always embarked on, and which then had immediate knock-on effects on the media, for instance, or on other parts of society.
So my last question, if I may. So Turkey, in my opinion, has been a leading case of right-wing populism, where authoritarianism has been also very much powerful. And, well, as I said, we are now we have a contested decision of Supreme Electoral Board, a contested annulation of the elections, where actually it has been proven that populists can be also defeated democratically through elections, despite the lack of equal fair play in the campaigning period. So I just wonder how you see Turkey, how Turkey is seen from where you are, both from an academic perspective but also politically.
So I think this points to a pattern that we don't always see. I'm not saying it's a total regularity, but we see it quite often. and I think it's maybe important to elaborate on why we see it. Namely, precisely this tendency to contest election outcomes, to claim there's been voter fraud, and so on. It doesn't always happen. I mean, there have been populist parties which have conceded defeat. But why does it happen so often? Well, these parties, on one level, suggest that only they represent what they often call the real people or the silent majority. If you follow that logic, if the majority can express itself, by definition, they always win. So if they lose, there has to be something else going on. And very often, in one way or another, these parties will then suggest that actually at issue is not the silent majority, but a silenced majority. So somebody behind the scenes must have been manipulating things to prevent the majority from truly expressing itself. And this, I think, is a worrying tendency, because even if eventually they do concede defeat, of course they communicate to their followers that the institutions can't be trusted. They communicate various forms of conspiracy theory. There's always, somebody behind the scenes manipulating things. And I think it's important for other actors to kind of underline very clearly that, of course, any of us can criticize, let's say, our election system or how campaign finance works. There's plenty to criticize in many countries. But there's a difference between somebody who makes these criticisms with ultimately empirically verifiable claims. Is there or is there not voter suppression in parts of the United States, for instance, as opposed to populists who, at least on occasion, end up saying something like, our system is rigged and rotten because I didn't win. That is not a democratic claim. And I think it might be helpful if others sort of pushed back against these sorts of claims as often as possible.
Mm-hmm. Professor Müller, thank you very much for joining.
Thank you for having me.
So, dear watchers, today I had Professor Jan-Werner Müller from Princeton University with me, and thank you for watching us, and keep watching us. Thank you.